Hey everyone, welcome to session 2.1. We're going to be exploring the biology of the brain and how it relates to learning, especially learning and teaching, or from the educational perspective. So here's our brain. A couple things to note about it. It's about roughly the size of a coconut, and it feels a lot like cold butter. But remember, it's a complex component of our body that learns, that remembers, that thinks, and problem solves. However, some things about our brain in particular is that the size hasn't changed a whole lot, at least from early childhood. For instance, a first grader, their brain is roughly 90 to 95% the size of an adult. And a fully mature brain actually occurs from ages 20 to 25. So as you can see, that an early childhood brain or a first grader's brain does not change a whole lot from that until an adult brain. But what we do know is that the neural complexity of the brain, or how it functions and how it structures, vastly changes based on the experiences and how learning is occurring. So we're going to explore that. Here's just an overall picture of brain structure and function. I'm not going to go into too many details about it, but one thing in particular I do want to mention that's not on this picture is the prefrontal cortex, which is here, right, located just by the forehead, which is the cognitive control action of the brain, meaning it coordinates the thought and the action in ways that reflect a person's goals and feelings associated with those. So, do you feel like going to class today or not? It also regulates attention, plans complex behavior, makes decisions, conflicting thoughts, and helps to predict future events. So the prefrontal cortex is right there, located right by the forehead. That's not located on this picture. But again, have a look at the other ones here and see how they they could actually relate to learning and memory. For instance, language up here, thinking, planning, problem solving, motivation, big thing for especially teenagers. But we're going to explore the hippocampus first. So the hippocampus is associated with memory, and think about where it's located. It's located right in the mid of the brain, protected by that skull, because that memory is so important. But it's memory that's associated with long-term knowledge. In this movie here, it's called Inside Out. It's a kids movie from Pixar, but basically this is like the hippocampus, and every one of these little balls here are long-term are a memory essentially from our past experiences, and we store them all here. But it's how we retrieve them is how we actually learn. If you click on the clip right here, it'll take you to a cute little video from the movie, but it gives you a better idea of how the hippocampus actually works. But with these experiences, we're able to make new connections or new experiences from neurons. Now, neurons are the nerve cells that make all the brain functions possible. And this is a picture of a neuron. It looks kind of like a plant and roots, perhaps. But the big areas to point out are the dendrites right here. And the dendrites form and have valid connections based on the more learning that takes place, the stimulation that occurs when we learn, and use of senses. The myelin sheath right here that's yellow is actually typically white, but this is actually controls how fast the connections are made, how fast we pick up content, how fast we pick up on material. And then these little guys back here are the axon terminals. They connect to a new neuron. So picture another dendrite over here that connects to another learning or another memory, so to speak. So that's kind of an overview of hippocampus and the neurons. So when we are exposed to a stimulating environment or a great lesson, we stimulate neurons. So down here, I have this kind of picture I found online that was pretty good. But think of it as two different destinations. So we're in Boston here, and the train station is the nucleus right here. But in order to get to New York, we have to take the railway, which is the myelin sheath. Now it depends how fast we're going to go. We're going to go in a little are we going to go in a little Cessna plane, or are we going to go in a 747? This is going to determine how fast that new connection is made, the connection to New York that happens. And with this connection changes based on how many dendrites are located here. And the more dendrites located here happen from more learning and more experiences, and stimulating environments. So with repeated stimulation, the number of connections between neurons increases, and more keep building all the time. Now, how education affects our brain development relate to a couple different areas. The first one is neuroplasticity. And I want you to think of neuroplasticity, which is essentially the brain's capacity to change its structure or response to an experience. The experience that drives experiences from environmental stimulation, thoughts and actions that occur in music, athletics, things like that. Basically, experiences actually will change the makeup of our brain and how it functions, which is why no two brains are alike. But the other thing to point out is through stimulating environments, that's how we have change. That's how our brain functions even better. So we look at from two different perspectives. Basically, with information, greater use of our brain in stimulating environments promote a highway, so to speak, I-20, or less use of stimulating environments or learning perhaps are kind of the equivalent of a dirt road in Georgia. Perhaps nice and pretty, but certainly take you longer to get there as potholes and dirt are a hindrance in reference to, in comparison to a nice paved freeway, so to speak. So the use it or lose it mentality is true especially through current research. Now, neuronal development are some things to point out. For instance, in ages 6 to 12, we do know that neural interconnectivity occurs rapidly during this time period, which is why it's so crucial for children in early elementary to have really enriching and new experiences and new environments. So you want everything to be very stimulating, very colorful, very interactive for children at this age, and that's where those dendrites are forming and forming and forming. But what we do know is when children get to about age 12 and up, even in our ages, that we actually have longer or better sped up connections, but also longer attention spans. We're able to answer hypothetical questions instead of lower order questions. We think, we plan ahead, we can control our impulses, understand consequences of actions, which even relate to classroom management. But we're able to look at things from multiple lenses. And so that's where we can really dive into material so much deeper with adolescence versus early childhood. But in early childhood, we do need to have those multiple, again, stimulations and experiences, and that's how their brain is vastly going to change and develop. So here's a little picture of a sweet little rat, if there are such a thing, but some research related to rats. So they took rats and put them in a stimulus-rich versus a deprived environment. So the stimulus-rich environment for some rats had, cedar chips, very cushiony, very soft flooring. They had lots of colors, lots of toys, food and water. It was very, again, enriching, something for them to do. But in the deprived environment, the rats didn't have any toys, no cedar chips, but yet they did have food and water. So what they looked at is their brains. So they let the animals live a comfortable life, and they actually lived for the same amount of time. But what was different was that there was lots of branching in the dendrites, from the dendrites in the environment that was rich, very complex connections in the brain that had a strong stimulus-rich environment, and very few dendrites in the deprived environment. So how the brain works vastly changes with what we are exposed to. Have a look at the video below at Brains at Play, and it goes into this a little bit deeper, but it's a really fascinating study that kind of enforces the reasons that we need to play or being exposed to multiple sensories in how our brain functions. Through continual use, we also know that it's so important. We looked at a couple different studies. So for instance, in blind students who read Braille, we know that the area of the brain that senses touch with the right index finger, which is how people read Braille, was much larger in people who are blind than it is in people who see, because the right index finger was utilized. Same thing with the 4 left fingers of a violinist. They look at those, and that particular area in the brain was that much more complex than those that did not play violin. Same thing with juggling. We found that those areas that are involved with that part of the brain increased significantly related to motor activity. But as soon as we stop doing these things, consequently enough, that particular area in the brain actually goes back to normal, so to speak. So when you stop playing violin, you're not getting the dendrites, stimulation that you used to get, or juggling. So it's kind of a use it or lose it mentality when that stimulation occurs. Couple last things here to point out, but think of your brain as like a fireworks show. Learning is electrical, learning is engaging and exciting and explosive, and think of your brain like this. And that's how we want to teach and have really engaging lessons and engaging environments. And that's how students are going to learn better and process better, and also have better classroom management. Also, look at this picture down here. And this is a picture from Dr. Chuck Hillman, who's done some extensive research with activity and learning. But see how the brain actually changes based on sitting quietly or staying sedentary versus when we actually go for a walk or energize. Go back here. So this brain actually changes when we put activity or motor learning involved. And so it's so much more stimulated, and we're ready to go and learn better when activity is involved. So try to go for a walk in a few minutes. Last couple things to point out, but applying to teaching, I want you to think of, what does an enriched classroom look like, or think back to what it used to look like, in elementary school or middle school perhaps. And what would an enriched lesson look like, as opposed to a boring lesson look like? And can students actually be overstimulated? That's another thing I want to point out. Is it possible to do that? And here are some answers. So some tips for the trenches. Learning from real-life problems and concrete experiences helps students construct knowledge and also give them multiple pathways for learning and retrieving information. So the more application-based you can make your learning, the better it is for connectivity of neurons and for connection to happen. Theory is great, but when you don't have the theory to practice, that's when you lose a lot of that learning, or it takes longer to process. And then also large general concepts are important as well, but you want to make sure that you kind of emphasize them over having smaller specific facts, because those aren't going to help you as much or as well. So keep the big picture as opposed to little small minute details. They're not going to serve you well. And then last 2 things, stories should be used in teaching. Basically, when students are exposed to stories, students are able to listen and focus better as a result of there's a beginning, a middle, and end. And most times our brains work that way, where we actually see things in a order and order processing. So it certainly helps if you can have stories or use stories in teaching. We do know they do make a significant difference to our students. And one thing was a mentor of mine told me that I think is important to emphasize for overstimulation, that you don't have to bring in an elephant to teach the word gray. So even though you want to teach the word gray, you don't have to have the biggest thing there that is going to overstimulate the classroom. There are other ways to do so. So keep it simple, but keep it engaging. And I'm sure you'll notice a difference among your students' cognition levels, and also from a classroom management standpoint and engagement. Thanks so much.